when it comes to this thing. I think that he's been pushed in this direction by Cheney. And so one of the things about the Jewish intellectual movement, another trait, is that they have always had non-Jews recruited. If you look at the left, you know, they've always recruited non-Jews. I have a little footnote in my chapter on the left where I was recruited when I was a student to give a talk about how, you know, why someone from a small town in Wisconsin would become a political radical. You know, but it was obvious I was very different from the rest of them. I wasn't Jewish. I was, you know, but. And if you look at psychoanalysis, you have people like Ernst Jones. If you look at Boasny,
he was the Gentile face on psychoanalysis.
Yeah, he was the Gentile face. And Dick Cheney sort
of.
What
about Gus Hall? Did Gus Hall fill that niche in the communist movement here in the United States?
And there were a whole lot of leftists like that. They were constantly being brought in to have very visible positions in leftist movements.
So the Jewish nature of the.
Yeah, but if you're a Jew and you want to appeal to non-Jews, what do? You don't have a lot of Jewish people. You have sympathetic non-Jews, and that was true in the Soviet Union. That non-Jews who liked Jews, got along with Jews for one reason or another, made alliances, were brought in these movements. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why non-Jews are going to do these things. You know, ranging from deeply held personal beliefs to you know, it's certainly good for their career. I mean, you think about someone. If you get into this neoconservative group, you know, you're going to have major outlets in the media. Your books are going to be published. You're going to be reviewed in the New York Times. Everything's going to be wonderful. But I'm not saying that Cheney's like that, but he has a long association with these neocon think tanks going back 20 years. This is not something that just happened. And if people have been paying attention in the year 2000 in this election, which I wasn't, but if people had been paying attention, they would have noticed this. You know, that Paul Wolfowitz was in line to be the second in command at the Pentagon. You know, that's huge, because if you knew Wolfowitz, you'd know what was going to happen.
Now, a question, we've obviously covered radical left politics, Marxism, and related subjects. Anthropology, Franz Boas. He's not a household name, but he's a pivotal figure in modern anthropology. Tell us who Franz Boas was and what were his discoveries.
Franz Boas was well, I don't think he had any discoveries. That's the problem. Most of these theories, they're not, you know, they're built.
Theories, let us say.
He was a Jewish guy from Germany. He was brought up in a sort of radical family. He's politically radical.
What years?
Socialist. He was probably born around 1850.
Whatever. So it was around the turn of the century.
Around there. So he came to this country, became established eventually at Columbia University. And what he did was he gathered around him at Columbia all these students, churned out PhDs, and they put them in the top anthropology departments around the country. So by the 1920s, he and his students absolutely dominated American anthropology.
And what were they?
And they had a theory. You know, race does not exist. That there's no, you can't talk about, you know, different cultural levels, and that was the main message. It was essentially an attempt to say that there are no differences between Europeans and their wonderful civilization versus someone in the outback, you
Samoans
know,
or whatever.
In Samoans or whatever. That they're the same. Everybody's the same. But these cultures, and if there are differences, it's totally a matter of culture. Culture produces, you know. And so Margaret Mead went down to Samoa, and she said that they live in a paradise down there, and they're much more rational when it comes to sexual mores. They don't have any rape. Everybody's happy. It turns out, you know, anthropologists went back there and said that they didn't find the same society. You know, that there was rape, and that there's a lot of oppression of women and so on. So it was a story that was propagated.
Was it used to deconstruct a sense of white superiority?
Absolutely.
That was prevalent at that time?
That's exactly it. You know, when Margaret Mead, when Boas, a student, Margaret Mead came back, she had a story that would do exactly that. Say that the Western sexual mores were essentially messed up. That you should learn from these more primitive people, that they know how to run these things, and in some ways their cultures are superior to yours. And
did it, like Marxist ideology, make an exception for Jews within the anthropological context here, or was it just ignored?
I don't know that they ever talked about Judaism much. I suppose they would have just talked about cultural relativism, that it's just another culture.
Right, I see.
There are no genetic differences and so on. But yeah, it's, you know, one other thing about them is that they were on the political left too, and that's the thing about those movements I discussed in culture critique. And I didn't talk about the neocons and culture critique, but the ones I did were on the left. I mean, all of them, including Boas. I mean, he was a socialist. He was very sympathetic. He was involved in these sort of communist sympathizers in the 1930s. I mean, during the 1930s, the American culture was very strongly influenced by the Communist Party. And you had people like Boas who were fronting these groups and giving them respectability. So they were on the far left. And that then fed in the Civil Rights Movement after the war. The American Anthropological Association made statements, you know, saying no such thing as race, you know, and that sort of thing. And
have Boas's ideas, were they used to change immigration policy?
Absolutely. He was quoted, you know, during in 1965 when the gates finally fell, and actually quite a long time before that by the people who opposed the immigration law of 1924. They would often quote Boas saying, you know, there's no such thing as race. We have no reason to keep anyone out. You know, if the Africans will make just as good American citizens as anybody else, and that it's racism to favor the peoples of northwestern Europe, which the previous laws did. They didn't, in a way, they didn't really favor it. What they did was establish an ethnic status quo. They say the people who voted for the law of 1924 basically said, we like the country the way it is. We like the people in the proportions that they are. We're not going to try to get rid of blacks. We're not going to try to get rid of Jews. We're just going to leave it the way it is.
But Boas and others worked against that. They wanted to.
No, they wanted to get more. They wanted to
have more third world immigration.
Again, my view has been that one of the constants of 20th century Jewish immigration, of Jewish intellectual movements, has been to lessen the power of Europeans in America.
And why is that?
And because they felt that that power represented a threat to them, and especially in the long run.
They wanted to have the United States become less Christian, less European. White European.
Yeah,
why is that?
Because, and then you can easily find Jewish activists who say that when they talk about immigration. But the idea is that if you have a homogeneous European society, you can easily evolve towards Nazism. In other words, but if you have a society where each ethnic group has a sort of, you know, only a very, very limited power, then that could never happen. You can never have a coalition of white people.
They wanted to have a multicultural
society, which also rationalized Judaism.
And in fact, you said that multiculturalist ideology was in fact invented by Jewish intellectuals?
Yeah, in particular
was it
Horace Kallen. What? He's a philosopher.
Who's that person?
Horace Kallen, K-A-L-L-E-N. He's very famous. He was a Zionist. He was very strongly identified Jew himself, and he didn't like this melting pot idea, which actually was advanced by an earlier generation of Jewish intellectuals. But Kallen, you know, liked the idea that the United States would be composed of these groups, you know, of ethnic groups that would sort of stay separate, like Jews have always had.
So it makes the United States safer for people to be Jews if there's not a large dominant white majority.
Absolutely, because you know, again, when Jews came to this country, they saw American culture in negative terms, and
it looked too much like Nazi Germany. Maybe it was too white.
They actually did a survey or something back in the 60s. They talked to Jews. You know, they asked them, would it be possible that it could happen here? And you didn't have to say what it was. It is the Holocaust. In other words, something horrible to happen to Jews. So that's sort of always hanging over them. How do we change this country to make it Holocaust-proof?
Well, this also brings to mind another thing which I read in your book, and that was a lot of Jews, not all by any means, preach universalism but practice particularism. Is that what you mean?
That's been the case, especially with Jews on the left. Yeah, I mean, that's been a common, and as I say, all those movements that I dealt with in culture critique, they've had this sort of universal veneer. I mean, if you look at psychoanalysis, I mean, it talked about, you know, repressions and so on, and this and that. There's never anything about ethnic particularity. And certainly that was the view of Marxism. It was a sort of universal class movement, nothing to do with ethnic.
But if I may say so, you also say that anti-Semitism has always been a defensive strategy, anti-Semitism?
Well, I wouldn't say always, but I would say that the major anti-Jewish movements throughout history have been, you know, had been the result of real conflicts of interest. And
so